What lay at the center of African civilizations before its disintegration is only now being discovered, as I say. 2 years ago, one of our Earth satellites spinning around this planet sent down radar beams into Africa 16 feet below the African Earth and found the traces of ancient rivers running from the Sahara towards the Nile Valley, where the Africans retreated as the Sahara dried up, peopling Ethiopia and then Egypt. I said that before the Earth satellite. I said that in my book 7 years ago. A few anthropologists said it based on linguistic evidence, the spread of linguistic networks coming out of the Saharan era, on basis of agricultural techniques coming from the Saharan agricultural complex into the Sudanic agricultural complex, moving up from Nubia into Egypt, on the basis of the movement of scripts, the markings on the rocks, etc., how they were, on the basis of skeletal material which showed, like in the Scandinavian expedition to Sudanese Nubia, showed the movement, the migration of these people. It was only in 1962 that we found the last critical link, one of the most important discoveries in African civilizations in the last 300 years. We found the last missing link that now establishes beyond the shadow of a doubt, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that classical Egyptian civilization and its science is fundamentally African. We discovered at Kaseti, at Kustal in Nubia, on the edge of the Sudan, a kingdom, a black monarchy preceding the Egyptian by at least 200 years. And in that area, at Kaseti, in the Nile Valley, which we now call the Middle East, we found a black kingdom where 12 black kings reigned before the Africans pushed up further into Egypt. They had already in Egypt, before their kings pushed up into Egypt, controlling the northern area and establishing the dynasty of Menes, which is followed for about 1,000 years by predominantly African types. Pyramid building, mummification, the deities that were to build the pantheon of gods of the Egyptians, all the religious, political, and scientific traditions that were to make classical Egypt the beginnings of the pharaonic thing, is found in Nubia at Kustal, 200 years before it even begins to take a shape and to be carried forward into Egypt. We have even found the hieroglyphs, which we thought was Egyptian in origin. It was merely refined further by the Africans as they moved up in Egypt. We find the hieroglyphs at Kustal in Nubia, one of the world's most significant writing systems. Significant because it was to affect not only Africans, it was to have an influence also on some of the European writing systems. We are supposed to be the pre-literates. When I was going to London University, the School of Oriental and African Studies, they always refer to Africans as pre-literates. There's something missing in our brain. We learn to write late. No, sir. No, sir. Africans had at least half a dozen scripts before they were touched by Europe. They built the hieroglyphic script, and the oldest books in the world, of which we still have fragments in spite of massive destruction in the long span of time, the oldest medical texts and the oldest mathematical texts in the world are African. There is no doubt about it. Absolutely none. This is not speculative, romantic myth-making. These are the facts. Not only do they have the hieroglyphic script, which we find originated among the blacks prior to their movement up with it into Egypt, they have found also the Meroitic script. We have found 800 and something texts in that. It has not yet been deciphered. We have the Akan script, both the drum script, which is highly complex, because the Africans are the only people who created drums that could mimic the human voice. So they have both a drum script in Akan as well as a written script in Akan. They have the Afaka script, which I found people in Suriname in 1981 were writing letters to their girlfriend in the Afaka script, which they had brought with them to the Americas. That was unusual because most Africans lost their scripts. Those who did have scripts lost them in the Middle Passage, but they had made the mistake of bringing a whole tribe, a whole body of people into Suriname. That's why they were able to revolt. They could communicate with each other, whereas the normal practice with slaves is that you separate them so they could start fighting among each other, or at least not have any proper communication. And also the Manding script, which Professor Winters and Howe and Delafosse have shown to be pre-European, pre-colonial period, Manding running through the Sahara, touching parts of the Ethiopian and even the Egyptian world. Those are just a few. And people say, yes, but if they had scripts, why didn't they write books? They wrote books. The Library of Alexandria had, it is estimated, at least 500,000 books. It was systematically destroyed. The Moors had books. Not all of them were black, but most of them, especially in the Almoravid and Almohadi dynasties, the 4 Muslim dynasties in Europe, they wrote books. In 1492, the year Columbus sailed, when Cardinal Ximenes, attacking Granada, ordered, after they defeated Granada, Cardinal Ximenes ordered every book in Arabic to be burnt. At a time when most Africans and Arabs and even the Jews in Spain and Portugal wrote in Arabic. They burnt them all. Only a few fragments survived. Timbuktu was razed to the ground twice. Only recently the Arabs have found scraps and fragments coming from the University of Timbuktu. So it's not a question of not writing books. Only a few people wrote, even in Europe. When the Muslims invaded Europe, it is estimated that 99% of the Europeans were illiterate. This is in 711 AD. 99%. The European Christians had 2 universities. The Muslims introduced 17. In Europe, 17 universities. Everything that was of value throughout the civilized world. In Africa, particularly in Egypt.
It must be now emphasized that Nubia is the mother of Egypt, just as Ethiopia is the mother of Nubia, and just as Somalia, Kenya, Uganda is the grandmother of Egypt. If we are to look, no society in human history starts at the end of a river and work up against the current of that river. Because the means by which men would travel up the river had to be locomotion. There was no sailboat for man to use when he first started to navigate the river. He started with logs, solid logs of tree that he realized floated. He then started to tie logs together to give more buoyancy for those of you in engineering. And then man started to hollow out logs in order that he may take much more weight. And that was the beginning of man's transportation along the river. He traveled on the river before he traveled on the wheels. He traveled on the river before he started traveling on the backs of other animals besides himself. And we must go back to these in order to understand. We must go back to the paintings of the Grimaldis, the paintings of other small African people, namely the Hutu, and also the Kalahari, the Khoikhoi, and other Africans, especially those that went into Egypt, namely the Sebenetos. I don't have time to talk and to spell these names because I've spoken to you a number of times, and by now you should be able to spell those words. It was not until as late as the 1500 that Egypt, the same Egypt that we are talking about, became extended to what is now called Aswan, Aswan or Senusset, or Senort, as it was called. It was 1500 before the Common Era that Egypt took over Nubia from a place now still called Assuit. Deep into the southern part of Egypt was the northernmost part of Sudan, or Aswan, or Nubia. Go back again. If you are accustomed to Egypt and you are in Luxor, you must travel north. That means going down the Nile to at least 200 miles north to come to Assuit. You draw a horizontal line parallel to the equator and run it across Egypt, and that's where Nubia, up until 1500, which will bring us into the 18th dynasty, that was still Nubia. So when you're speaking about Nubia, you are speaking about the creation of dynastic Egypt. And again, that's what we have overlooked in our Greek mythology, in our Greek training, in our European education. The 18th dynasty, or 1500 and thereabout, bring us at a period of time when we are speaking about the Inhoteps. That would include Akhenaten. It brings us before the very noted, and in my case, the most noted of the Egyptian pharaohs in terms of what they contributed to society, which will be Ramesses II, and all that happened subsequent to that. However, what is overlooked is the role that Nubia played even in dynastic Egypt. We know of Nubia, and we deal with Nubia in terms of one particular person, and that would be the wife of Ramesses II, Nefertari II, because we then generally don't speak of Nefertari in terms of second. She is the second. There was a previous Nefertari, which we will speak about later. Nubia not only gave to Egypt Nefertari II or Nefertari first, but Nubia passed on her culture to Egypt. We think of Nubia in terms of the Nubian dynasty, 24th, 25th, depends on whose chronology you're using, and that would be a point when Egypt was already start to decay. Egypt was already in her dying days when we are talking about the point when the dynasties were controlled under Nubian tutelage. I am talking about Nubian dynastic influence from the time of Aha, A-H-A, and the time of another man who was confused with Aha, namely Narmer. The Greeks were the ones who decided that Narmer was the first of the pharaohs, call him Mena, as well as they call him later Menes. But in fact, it was Aha who really started. There were 3 Ahas, and only 2 are recorded in Egyptian history. One of the Aha is said to be the first priest of ancient Egypt. This Aha was the one that introduced the Nubian god to Egypt. But that Nubian god has been carefully suppressed. We are talking about Mendelusi. Mendelusi is said by certain Western historians to be the brother of Osiris. In other writings, he is said to be the son of Osiris and brother of Horus. But in Nubian mythology, if you want to call it that, in Nubian religiosity, Mendelusi is the equal brother of Osiris and the senior brother of Osiris. Why isn't Mendelusi mentioned? When we go to the temple of what is called collapture. That's a German terminology, collapture. That temple was Kolo Boyo Temple, K-O-L-O, one word, B-O-Y-O, Kolo Boyo Temple. You will notice that when you go to that temple, there are stones belonging to the previous temple that was there. There are animals of ancient Africa and the Nile in particular shown on those stones that you find nowhere else. And then you recognize that there was a temple there hundreds of years, thousands of years that predated the temple that was built much later, equally by Nubian people. Stop and consider who worked the quarries of Nubia. There is not another place in all of Egypt where one can find marble other than Aswan. No place else. And no one can show that any marble was brought from a foreign state, whether a foreign state in Africa or a foreign state in Asia. We do not need to speak about Europe because Europe is not in history yet.
The Nile River, rising out of the interior of Africa, rushes down the mountains on its journey to the Mediterranean Sea. On its way, it carries precious fertile earth, which it deposits on its banks. For a few miles on each side of the Nile, there is a green belt that quickly melts into the surrounding desert. About 10,000 years ago, people began migrating toward the Nile and ultimately drifting into and settling its fruitful plain. An ancient and proud people who would build a great civilization, who would create an empire that would extend into the interior of Africa, engulf Asia Minor, embrace the Middle East, and influence the entire Mediterranean world. These ancient people would build monuments of great magnitude and splendor, monuments that would be the envy of the ancient world, monuments that would serve as the blueprint and foundation for modern civilization. They also invented law and mathematics, science, writing, music, and agriculture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Strong evidence indicates that they came from the south, from a country through which the Nile flows, from the land of Nubia, or what we call the northern Sudan in Africa. It was only natural for ancient explorers to follow the Nile River in order to find where it was going, and in doing that, to settle along its banks and to ultimately found a great and thriving civilization. The Nubians of antiquity stated that Egypt was the colony of their land, and that the Egyptians derived their laws and customs from their Nubian cousins to the south. A number of scholars hold this opinion today.
The pharaonic civilization that later came to characterize ancient Egypt had already existed in what we call Nubia for at least 300 years before the first dynasty. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Egypt and Nubia were part of the same cultural complex. There was no essential cultural, linguistic, ethnic, or racial difference between them. The differences, such as they were in the manner of regional differences, much as the difference you might find in England between, say, an Englishman and a Welshman, in the Central Europe between a German and an Austrian, in Italy between an Italian, for example, and a Sicilian. So even though these are regional variations, if you will, they still belong to the same general civilization complex. So did Egypt and Nubia, and the Egyptians themselves said so. They themselves knew that their civilization derived from the southern part of their, south of their borders, and they knew that it derived from what we call Nubia, or Ethiopia. So civilization itself descends the Nile from Inner Africa. If you will, it crystallizes in Nubia and then reaches its highest and final form in the land called Kemet, or ancient Egypt, over a period of 4,000 years of unbroken Egyptian civilization.
Modern evidence appears to confirm the tradition that civilization traveled northward from Nubia into Egypt. Skulls and skeletons unearthed in Nubia and Egypt are of the same or similar African racial type. Some of the most ancient paintings drawings of Nubians and Egyptians also depict them as a distinctly African people. As Dr. Finch has noted, Egypt's general political structure and divine kingship appear to have been modeled after the Tasseti dynasty of Nubia that preceded that of Egypt by over 200 years. In other words, there were pharaohs ruling Nubia long before Egypt became a nation. Some scientists insist that pyramid building also began in Nubia and was refined and perfected after the Nubians moved northward and settled in Egypt. Even mummification appears to have started in Nubia and to have spread northward into Egypt 500 years after it was invented. Nubia was also considered the land of the gods and the spiritual home of the Egyptian people. Perhaps that is why the chief beneficent gods and goddesses of Egypt, such as Osiris and Isis, were depicted as blacks. Finally, during all of her periods of upheaval, chaos, and foreign invasions, Egypt was rescued and reunited by powerful black men from the Nubian south. This was true of the Mentuhoteps in the Middle Kingdom, it was true of Ahmose I in the New Kingdom, and it was true of Pianki and Taharka during the 25th dynasty.
Although not all scientists and scholars agree, the weight of evidence certainly points toward a black origin of Egyptian civilization. In time, of course, Asians and Europeans settled Lower Egypt near the Mediterranean Sea and ultimately intermingled with the native black population. Nevertheless, Egypt's cultural, physical, and spiritual legacy was chiefly derived from the black Nubian South. This no doubt explains why, in later years, the visiting Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, and others described the ancient Egyptians as black-skinned with close curled hair. The distinguished writer Dr. W.B. Du Bois captured the opinions of the ancients when he wrote, "We conclude, therefore, that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended, not from the whites or the yellows, but from the black people of the South. Thence they traced their origin, and toward the South in earlier days, they turned the faces of their buried corpses." Du Bois might also have added that the Egyptians themselves called their country Kemet, which many scholars interpret as land of the blacks. Now that we've learned about the origin of these ancient people, let us see how Egypt became a great African nation.
Yeah. Egypt made me a man. It turned me around the Nile River and the valley, from Ethiopia and down. And then I had to look for the source because everything points to me that it isn't from here. That when the Europeans come for the first time, the Greeks being the first one of them, that they didn't understand what they were seeing. I look at the ink and noticed that everywhere on the Nile I went, it led me back upstream. And as I looked and the examples of the artifacts coming from different places, I found that it's among the Twa and the Hutu, which you call the Pygmies, the smallest of our people, that symbol was first used. Then I understood. But later I was to be reading and found the papyrus of Hunefa, which stated emphatically that leave no doubt in my mind who was the Egyptians. It leave no doubt in my mind the doubt that Diane Ravage, Alfred Levine, and Arthur Schlitznger et al. And sorry, Mayor Dinkenstein. Could not understand. You see, what it says, Hunefa is writing, we came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwells, at the foothills of the mountain of the moon. There was nothing to debate. I don't need Herodotus to tell me what Hunefer was saying. Hunefer was quite specific. He was speaking about his fellow Egyptian, his fellow priests, that we had come from the beginning of the Nile. So all I had to do is use my engineering skill now and go to the map and find the beginning of the Nile. I didn't need Burton to lie and say he found the source of the Nile. Hunefer had already told me what the source of the Nile is. And when I looked at the source, I found it was not only one source, there were three sources. Two of them in the highlands of Ethiopia, one of them in Uganda. The source of the White Nile being in Uganda at Mwanza Nyanza, the British one time called it Victoria. How are you going to name a lake for a sick-ass white woman? If you had put Victoria in the lake, it would have contaminated all the waters. Here's a woman that bragged. This woman bragged she was the cleanest woman in Europe. In 1 year, she had taken a bath. The source of the Blue Nile being Lake Tana and the Atbara River. Those were the sources of the Nile. So Hunefer had already told me that the Egyptians were Central East Africans. So I wasn't surprised that there would be a Diane Ravage to fight me about it, because Diane Ravage wants to come from Poland, and that's not the source of the beginning of the Nile. She wants to come from Poland and Russia and France and England and wherever else to Egypt and lie. Lie like the rabbis lie, the black ones too, and say to me that they had something to do with the building of the pyramid. Ed Scott went there and lied the same way. Begin went there and lied the same way. They picked the largest of the pyramids to lie on. Adam and Eve wasn't in the picture when the pyramids were built, especially those at Giza, the largest one. They were built in the 4th and 6th dynasty. The first Jew, Abraham, was not born until the 13th dynasty. How are you going to build a pyramid for Abraham?
Certain, and which we have found now, is the missing link, Tar City. In 1962, an American team under Keith Seal discovered a pharaonic dynasty south of Egypt, which had all the major markings of the pharaonic dynasties. There they found the palace facades and the palace erects. There they found the falcon god Horus, the son of God. Among the Egyptians, the Christ, the first Christ figure. And there they found the crown of the south, unmistakable shape of the crown of the south, and the heads of a dozen black pharaohs, even before Aha or Narmer-Menes or whoever, Scorpion or whoever was the first in Egypt. And there they found the beginnings of the hieroglyphs. In other words, there was now no question that the Nubian was not merely in the evening, he was in the dawn. And it took them 16 years before they announced this. They said it took them 16 years to put the pieces together. But there were some of those pieces, like a stone incense burner from Nubia, that didn't need putting together. It wasn't even broken. But the man in charge of that expedition, Keith Seal, sat on it until he died. And after he died, thank God for his passing at that stage, because were it not for that, we would not have even heard of it. There emerged from the back rooms of the museums things which had been pushed aside, and the whole new picture emerged. And then came people, this could not be true. Lost pharaohs of Nubia, Bruce Williams, it could not possibly be true. And there were attacks on Bruce Williams, and he replied brilliantly. If you read the papers, not only the lost pharaohs of Nubia, but the attack that was made and the brilliant defense point by point, you will know why this is so important. At UNESCO, Gamal Abdul Mokhtar, head of the project, when I asked him, I said, "Sir, I need Diop's paper, Origin of the Egyptians, to publish in the Journal of African Civilization." He said, "I will give you permission, Van Sertima, but you have to publish a disclaimer saying that we didn't all agree to it." This is the Egyptian, you know. Doesn't want to be called black. No, sir. Because the black figure had suffered a tremendous loss of status in the world. We had been turned slaves. So that when Count Volney, even in that late stage, walked among them, and they had already become mixed with many peoples, he said, "It is clear to me that this is a Negro race, and that we owe so much of our arts and sciences to these people we have made our slaves, the objects of our contempt." He was troubled by that guilt. And there were so many who went there with fixed ideas, like the man who wrote, Budge, who wrote the Egyptian dictionary, at first thinking they were Caucasoids or Afro-Asiatic, and when he started to write his dictionary, he began to realize all the roots of these things lie in Africa. And Gerald Massey saw that. And you look at the language, Kenti means south. And do you know what it also means? It means first. Those people south of them were first. And they created one of the names for Africa. Africa came through many names. Sometimes they were called Ethiopians and Libyans and all sorts of things. But there is a name that is in Egyptian, Afro-Ika. It was not for the continent, but it was for the people south of them. Afro-Ika meaning beginnings. And they call their people Kemiu, the dark people, the black people, Kemet, the black land. And they said the reason why it was calling it the black land is because the earth is black. I don't know what they're talking about. Everything had to be turned upside down to make it correct. The black does not fit here.
So we travel into Black Africa to learn the story of the Nile Valley, a story generally told from Egypt. Today we're going to tell the story from a place that thrived before Egypt, alongside Egypt, and after Egypt.
The lands to the south of Egypt, generally called Nubia, had 5 important golden ages. The first golden age, which was called Tarseti, some people call that, in translation, the land of the bow. This civilization was older than First Dynasty Egypt by about 200 years.
They also domesticated animals here first and before Egypt, so pastoralism was very important. Depending on how far back, if you say 9,000 years ago, then you can say yes, it was probably more developed than Egypt. But starting from the 4th millennium BC, the center really is in Egypt and develops from there.
Sudan was often ahead of Egypt in terms of developing technology because it had perhaps a smaller population. In Egypt, there's not much need for human economy. You don't need to save on human labor because every time the Nile flooded in midsummer, you had a huge reservoir of human labor as long as you were feeding them a living wage.
The ancient Egyptians themselves said that they came from the south of Kemet, ancient Egypt, which is further up, higher up the Nile Valley, closer to the source. And they identified the mountains of the moon, which are in modern-day Uganda, as their place of origin.
most historians now accept, even the European Eurocentric ones, that it is the movement of the peoples from the south to the north that gave birth to Kemet. However, what they fail to recognize that is not just the movement of these one set of Africans traveling from the south to the north, but also movements of other Africans coming from the west to the east. They met and collected together in what is now Kemet. That's why that civilization was so powerful, because it was a multicultural expression of the African experience. It was several sets of different Africans coming together in one place and creating a civilization.
We travel through Sudan, the largest country in Africa, to learn about a world that was already old before our world had even begun. The ancient land once known as Tarseti, Kerma, and Kush, home to the Nubians. This is a place where early Europeans came to study and learn from Africans, and to study from the oldest people in the world, Africans.
So when you hear recent discussions on who were the black pharaohs, referring in particular to the Nubian pharaohs or the Cushitic pharaohs, those pharaohs they often call black pharaohs in a way to try and distinguish them from the others, but they can't be, because as we said, all the early dynastic and intermediate pharaohs were black.
This is home to the world's oldest recorded religion, a place whose kingship and political system continued to bring harmony and prosperity to its people for over 3,000 years. Today, Sudan is the largest country in Africa, rich in oil and other natural resources, but a country culturally split by the Arab African North and the African South. In recent times, this country has been greatly affected by civil wars and droughts. This is a place where the great Blue and White Nile meet to form the famous river Nile that runs through Egypt. This is an amazing land that predates Egypt, but for many is just another part of our world's hidden history. The question is, what happened? What was this ancient civilization about? And what left it in ruin? Why do we only know the story of the Nile Valley from Egypt? And why do we think that Egypt is somewhere separate from Africa? What do we still have and use today that was connected to this time period? We're gonna peel back the pages of time and find out.
I'm standing here on ancient holy ground, in an area that was once part of the Napatan Kingdom. Today this place is known as Jebel Barku, which is an Arabic term that means holy mountain. It goes by this term because in ancient times, for over 1,000 years, this area was the Kemetic and Kushite religious center of the world.
Home to the Nubians, ancient Egyptians, and other traveling Africans.
Jebel Barku is a very important site, both in the history of Kush and in the history of Egypt, or Kemet if you prefer. The mountain had a particular shape, and both the Egyptians and the Kushites regarded this mountain as the holy mountain. That's what the Egyptians called it, the holy mountain.
So at Jebel Barku you have this great ritual religious complex which is set up in a monumental form that we see first when the ruler of Kemet conquers it, when Thutmose III is building his great temple there, and then it continues, and it's in that area that Napata is.
The city of Napata becomes a very important capital during this golden age of Kush. The site has a long history. We can trace it back to the 18th dynasty period of ancient Egypt, where the ancient Egyptians saw it as sacred to their deity Amen.
a really remarkable point in the landscape. And again, you have to be in the landscape, or you have to have the photograph of the landscape to understand how different it is and why it attracts attention. And people have different theories about that, but they don't tell us. They just call it the Jawab. And they saw there a certain kind of form of sacredness.
So the influence of the Sudanese Nubians in Egypt is quite clear, but on the other hand, the influence of the Egyptians themselves in traditions, in religion, is still people having different minds of is it originated from there, or is it being acquired or adopted as gods by the Nubians?
So here at Jebel Barkal, in between Upper Kemet and Lower Nubia, we find much shared culture. And there's much debate around whether it started deep in Africa, at the heart of the Nile, and spread upwards, or if it started in the north of Africa, at the bottom of the Nile, and spread down into Africa.
We must have in mind that these political borders were not there.
But the boundaries were constantly shifting in any case, and there'd always been a lot of trade between these two separate states, if you like.
When you talk about Lower and Upper Nubia, you're talking about a span of land where people have got blood relations, and they have got some sort of culturation and acculturation always happening there.
There'd always been a very strong relationship, and to me, the more I look at the cultures from these two separate states, the more similar they actually become. And I think we need to try and move away from some of the images that we see that show Nubia in particular as a very different country. We know for a fact that, as I've said, there was a lot of trade between the two, and that also many of the people would move across the borders effectively over time. So there's always a very strong, close relationship, and at certain times, you know, they were the same thing. They were just one.
It's like the relationship between America and England. England is the mother and father of America. The population of America are predominantly English American. The presidents of America are English American. Even though America is an expression of the European consciousness, the vast majority of people are European, the predominant power is the heritage that England has given it. The Americans acknowledge this. They trace their lineage, if they can, back to England and come back to here. The relationship is a special relationship of power. Though America has power on this earth, England is its mother and father and recognized as such. That is precisely the way that one should look at the relationship between Kemet and Nubia.
The religion of the Kushites is quite interesting. One of the important deities was Amen. Now, Amen is the pronunciation that the Hebrews give it, and some scholars agree to use that pronunciation. Amun is the pronunciation given to it by one of the old European scholars, Plutarch.
In the language of Kemet, the word for hidden is Imen, or Amun is the way that we put it in English. And Amun is the name of a goddess creator who is everywhere and hidden, combined with Ra'ah, who's the energy of the sun. That's the metaphor for the creator, so Amun Ra'ah. But Amun is the hidden part, very much like the Christian, Jewish, Muslim concept of God as everywhere and invisible.
The sun, the symbol of the creator, was reborn every morning. It reached its highest position in the day at noon, where it was known as Re. Re represented the creator, God, the sustainer of life on high at its highest point. When the sun set in the west, it was known as Amen. Amen is a Kemetic word which means hidden or concealed.
Amen was supposed to be unseen and therefore very all-powerful also, because Amen was responsible for creation. Amen was responsible for everything, knew everything, understood everything, could foretell everything, and so on, the great omnipotent and omnipresent divinity.
At this religious center, one of the main temples that is still here to be seen today was a temple that was dedicated to Amun. The ram was a sign that was always
associated to the worship of Amun. It has been claimed that during the time of these temples, it was the astrological age of the ram, what we know as Aries, and that's why the ram was represented.
They all worshipped god Amun, who was the same god as in Egypt, the state god of the pharaohs, whose main temple was in fact in Napata.
Their deity Amen, they make it quite clear. Amen is a deity coming from Kush. And then during the Kushite Golden Age, they resurrect that same belief system, and then they build monuments sacred to Amen, and then Amen's wife, or Amen's consort, Mut. Mut was the goddess of Amen. What's important here is that same site, the Egyptians had their belief that that's where Amen and Mut came from. So that becomes a very, very important center.
Within the African systems, be they in Kemet, be they in Nubia, or be they in Kush, the male god has an equal and opposite female god. We see this representation in all African cultural systems that flow.
Every Necher in Kemet had his female counterpart. So I reference a Sar and a Set. They were Necher who complemented each other. They were co-equals.
They are usually together in families, producing children. We have a man and a woman and a child produced as the union.
We tend to think of the deities as a family. It's not quite so biological, it's more religious.
In the beginning there was only Noon, the original ocean of chaos that contained the beginning of everything to come. Ra, the sun, was born and appeared to rise from the surface of the water. Ra then gave birth to two children, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Shu and Tefnut then had two more children, Nut, the goddess of sky, and Geb, the god of earth. And so with them the physical universe was created. From the union of Geb and Nut, 4 human children were born, and so the story of civilization begun.
The Egyptian creation story, in many respects, represents the development of a civilization and the growing of Egypt, I suppose. And it's coming out of something that's very simple and coming out of nature, and then is being developed by man and being developed also into obviously one of the greatest civilizations that there ever was.
The spiritual world represented the physical world. So as it was in heaven, so as it was on earth. The Africans came together in Kemet to build a heaven on earth.
So what you see is this combination of balance and harmony. The essence of what we find within traditional African society is an understanding of the totality of life that is literally matrilineal and is paired with the masculine energy in order to maintain its force and its operation throughout society. If you suppress the female, you suppress 50% of the power of the creator.
It seems to be really important, and in many respects the sort of male and female seem to represent the two different forces coming together. And I suppose it's a bit like the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt in some respects.
Because they understood that it wasn't just about gender. It was about the understanding of the energy and how it moves, how masculine energy moves and how feminine energy moves, and how to marry the two, which created balance, life.
The idea was to create a land which was like the land that was up in the skies and beneath the earth. And in that sense, they saw that how they were arranged in families was also how the gods must also be arranged in families, and how the spiritual energies of the universe must also be arranged in families because they are arranged in families.
3 of the most important Neteru in Kemet were Asar, Aset, and Heru.
Or to give them the more usual names, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. These three deities originally came from Kush.
These are very, very important triumvirate.
Their stories are as much mythology as they are history.
Now, according to Diodorus Siculus, who was one of the ancient Greek historians, Osiris was originally a community leader of very early Kush. He doesn't call him a king of Kush, but he makes it quite clear he was a leader.
Osiris is regarded as the founding father of Kemet. He unified the two lands. He established the first nation-state in the recorded history of humanity. He is said to have introduced writing, the writing which the ancient Kemites referred to as Medu Neter, or the writing of God when it was written, or the words of God when it was spoken. He is also said to have introduced agriculture and theology.
Also decided to take civilization to certain parts of the Nile Valley, as well as to other parts of the world.
Asar married a beautiful Nubian woman by the name of Aset, who was his co-regent, not his inferior, his co-regent. And when Asar decided that he was going to travel to other parts of Africa to share his technology with his brothers and sisters on the continent, he left his wife Aset to run their nation.
And he was very successful, very admired, and this provoked the jealousy of his brother, Set.
And Set then plotted to overthrow his brother Asar.
Set, or Sete in ancient Egyptian, murdered his brother, dismembered his body into 14 pieces, and then scattered those 14 pieces throughout Kemet.
When Aset learned of the murder and dismemberment of her husband, she fled for her life, and then she went searching for the missing parts of her husband's body. Aset found 13 of the 14 parts of Asar's body, and as she found each body part, she cleaned it, she anointed it with oils, and she laid all 13 parts out, and she literally remembered her husband, wrapped his entire body in bandages, and created the first mummy in the recorded history of humanity. As Aset was preparing to bury her husband, she grieved because she was about to bury the man that she loved. She grieved because she was still a virgin. They had never consummated their marriage, and thus she would never bear children by the man that she loved. And according to the story written on many papyri in Kemet, carved on several temples in Kemet, the spirit of Asar came and impregnated his virgin wife, Aset. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to their son, Heru.
Now, in the case of Isis or Set, she is the original Virgin Mother, and she is seen suckling Horus. He is shown as a child suckling his mother, and he's wearing the pharaonic headdress, making it clear that he was born a king.
Haru is the son of Osiris, and he's the embodiment of order. He has to take over the kingship, and he has to do that through a struggle.
So Heru was born, the son of a virgin. He was born with a specific purpose in life. That was to restore his father's kingdom, to do battle with his uncle Set and reclaim his father's throne.
Heru would then take up his father's struggle, in a way, against his uncle Seth.
One of those classic battles, not so much between good and evil, it's more a battle between order and anarchy.
And Heru eventually triumphs over Set.
At that moment, Heru was transformed, miraculously transformed into a falcon. He flew into heaven to meet with his father Asar, told Asar of his victory over Set. His father blessed him, and Heru then returned to Kemet as the legitimate heir to the throne. And when he ascended to the throne, the symbol of the Heru Badet, the winged sun disk, was a symbol that was carved above the entrance of every temple in Kemet to serve as a reminder of Heru fulfilling the reasons for which he was born. And at the moment Heru reclaimed his father's throne and was crowned the king of Kemet, his father Asar was resurrected from the dead and took his place on the throne of judgment.
According to Plutarch, What he says about Osiris is that Osiris was associated with the moon, and the moon has its lunar cycle and then disappears at the end of the lunar month, and then 3 days later is then reborn, and this is then the resurrection of Osiris after being dead for 3 days. So Osiris is then the god of death and resurrection.
And Seth, or Zetesh, is never thrown away. He's an important part of the whole series of gods. He's not the annihilating factor.
Set was not purely evil. Set represented the forces of discordance.
Zetesh still has to be there. If you take him away, you're taking away part of reality. But he shouldn't be king. So that balance between Hor and Zetesh is one where Hor, Heru, is meant to be very much on top and ruling.
And our ancestors were very inclusive. And they knew for certain that, as I said, there was a little bit of good in the worst of us and a little good of bad in the best of us. And they represented that in this way.
So the reigning ruler in Kemet, and this is taken over to an extent in Kush, the reigning king is Horus because he's managed to take over and rule.
I'm here at Naga, at one of the Kushites' most well-preserved sites here today in Sudan.
Temples were really important, both in Kemet and in Kush.
When you begin to look at the development of temples, the temples that we find in Nubia, the temples that we find in Egypt, the temples were universities.
In many respects, they were kind of mini universities. So you have your Egyptian elite living in the temples. They were developing languages, they were developing mythology, they were developing the religion.
There were places where the so-called priests, who were actually priest scholars, part of a system of learning.
And the fact that the temples not only acted as places of worship, but places of learning also.
One was the house of the book, and the other one was the house of life, Per Ankh, meaning house of the life, house of life.
The education was holistic. So you couldn't study maths without studying geography or biology. Everything was interconnected.
These priests that came out of these systems were to be the guardians or the custodians of this cultural practice. They were not theoretical religious people. They were individuals who were both warriors, both scholars, and both priests at the same time.
It might be important to look at the system of education as a system of formal learning and the system of socialization as a way or the way in which one generation was socialized into the fundamental values and rituals and meaning of life of the community and therefore of the society.
The belief was that you weren't born man or born woman, you were born male or born female. And through the process of passage, then you became male or you became female. The passage was intended to be arduous, rigorous.
They would have had to have gone to the temple and gone through certain rites of passage.
The socialization has to do with becoming an adult, with knowing your roles as an adult.
And the training was both physical, both mental, and both spiritual.
And a lot of this came to rest in the temple, where you had schools in the temple.
The temple itself was not to be worshipped. The people themselves understood that they were the most sacred thing, not the temple.
All the professions were premised upon somebody having completed what is called scribal training. To become a scribe was really to achieve the platform from which other careers took off.
What I also find very interesting and very attractive about the Kushite civilization was that, unlike in Egypt, where it was only the educated classes and the priesthood and so on who could read and write, in Kush they achieved a high level of literacy. That meant that humble people could actually read and write and were encouraged to do so.
In actual fact, I don't think there's any modern equivalent to one of these temples. They were both centres of scholarship, but they were also the centres of religion.
So the custodian, the intellectual custodian, was also a spiritual custodian. Was also the warrior custodian. In times of war, it was they that pulled up their cloth and went to war. It was also they that kept the spirit of that nation alive. It was also they who kept the intellect of that nation alive in books and study. So there was no separation. Kemetian philosophy is so monotheistic. All of it was part of the one science, which is life. This science was not separate from religion. So the science and the religion were combined together.
And it's that understanding that everything is interconnected, which is the spirituality.
Everything in the cosmos, in the universe, is related to everything else. We're all interconnected.
There is an understanding that there is one central energy source, but with different aspects. The aspects are represented by how we call in the Western world gods. But there is never a thinking that there isn't one monotheistic central source or power. There is the understanding, whether you're in Kemet, whether you're in Nubia or in Kush or in any of these kingdoms in the Nile Valley or any of the African kingdoms that follow subsequently, that there is one central source or energy from which everything comes from.
Clearly, they share the same religious beliefs as with the Egyptians, with some additions, so to speak. Some local gods were worshipped, like god Apedemak, a lion god. And you have to remember that lions were common here up until the early 19th century.
These historical sites found here in Africa are all that's left of the Nubian and Kushite cultures of people who lived all along the Nile Valley. These ruins are evidence of some of the world's earliest highly developed civilized cultures. These people had an understanding of astrology, medicine, philosophy. They had mapped out the world. They had circumnavigated and understood the planet that they lived on.
We find that the people of the Nile Valley were responsible for developing the first calendar of 365.25 days.
Now, because of the tropical or semi-tropical condition in the Nile Valley, there were clear nights and people could see the stars and the other heavenly bodies. And it is very clear that humanity began to notice patterns. Think about this. How long would it take, for example, for us to understand the movement of the moon?
The moon travels around the Earth every 27.322 days. Because of this, the ancients based their month around a 30-day cycle.
How long will it take for us to work out that the Earth goes around the sun once in every 365.25 days?
The calendar was utilized as late as 4,230 BCE. Now, in order to come to that definitive understanding of how long it takes the Earth to rotate on its orbit around the sun, you have to be able to make celestial observations for at least 1,000 years to identify the patterns, to then correct the patterns, to come up with the most accurate calendar that has ever been used by human beings.
The ancients of the Nile Valley based their year and months around the natural cycles of the universe. Each of their months was connected to an astrological sign, like our zodiac, and so their yearly calendar became a map of the Earth's human, earthly and heavenly cycles.
And this is where the sense of time, the whole question of the calendar, the year, different months came out of.
So you had groups of people who had time on their hand to observe their environment and then to produce great works that recorded their observations. So you had astronomers.
In terms of astrology, that was always, again, very important to the ancient Egyptians, and when people were born, they would actually have their charts drawn up.
We see water irrigation, we see aqueducts, we see underground heating, swimming pools, we see heated swimming pools.
We had people who studied rocks and minerals, geology.
These very brightly polished ones, that's again a classic Sudanese. I think that particular colour combination, those happen to be the colours of the modern Egyptian flag, but actually it's a very, to me, very Sudanese combination, that clear white with dark and red. Earlier in the history of Kemet, you get a lot of carnelian, the red stone, coming out of Nubia.
Precision drilling, iron smelting, precision iron smelting.
You had people who studied plant cycles, agriculture.
We see papyrus paper, we see glass making, we see stained glass, we see use of gunpowder, not in weaponry, but in religious services and religious rites.
You had people who studied building, how to build structures, what materials are best used to build structures.
This was a great golden age of pyramids, of temples, of writing, scholarship.
We see elements and a good deal of evidence, perhaps of electricity.
You had artisans who were responsible for creating great works of arts, sculptures, paintings.
Gold smelting, silver smelting, the creation of refined industries.
Hetepu. My name is Jabari Osaze, and this is Ancient Wisdom Daily, our daily discussion of the application of ancient wisdom in your modern lives. Today, I want us to think about an object that I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes. It actually is on an island all the way in the south of Kemet, an island that the Nubians lived on for many, many years. In fact, the modern Nubians live there today as well. It's usually called Sahel Island, and there's a great, great object on it, a stele that is known as the famine stele. On this stele, you'll see an interesting inscription. It seems to have, it relates to a situation that occurs in the Old Kingdom, but historians now believe that it actually was either written in the late period, during the Ptolemaic period, or that it was rewritten during that period. So it may actually reference a much older text. And it actually describes that there was a great famine in Kemet, and that the great king at the time, a man by the name of Djoser, sends his second in command, an incredible man by the name of Imhotep. You remember Imhotep? The world's first multi-genius, one of the world's earliest doctors? He sends Imhotep to the south, to Sahel Island, to see why this great famine is occurring, why this wonderful river that they knew as the Hapi, that today is misnomered the Nile, was not providing the wonderful flood that occurred every year, which created this fertile soil that allowed them to grow all of the things that they needed. And so when Imhotep goes down and sees this particular area, he does a very interesting thing. He pays homage to the local deities. He pays homage to the deity Khnum and the deity Ankhet, these wonderful deities that exist in this area. And in conversation with them, he is told that they will provide for the Kemetic people if they give to their shrines.
In the stele, for the first time, the king who is first called Karsha, was linked directly to the king of an earlier period, the 3rd dynasty step pyramid builder, King Neterket. More excitingly, later in the passage, we will see a first-person conversation between Neterket and the deified scientist architect Imhotep. Since Wilbur, the stele has been translated to various successes by Brox, 1891, Plet, 1891, Morgan, 1894, Seth, 1901, Barquette, 1953, Miriam Litcham, 1973, and it is also included in the Literature of Ancient Egypt edited by William Kelly Simpson, 2003, published by Yale. The story of Yebu in one document solves several important issues of African primacy. First, it points to an ancestral memory written in the Souls of Re, or the Ba-Re, of where the Nile Valley Africans sourced where they came from in the voice of the famous king Neterket, King Zoser. Second, it gives a first-person account of the king Neterket and Imhotep discussing our educational system or mystery system, the Hawa-Ankh or Per-Ankh. Third, it is most likely the world's oldest account of God and man interacting, and it is, or seems to be, an original source of several biblical stories, including the Adam and Eve story, the Abraham story, the Joseph story, and the Moses story. In this case, the God that they are speaking about is Khnum. He is a form of the one God that made intelligent life from inert materials on his potter's wheel, such as God creating man and woman in the beginning during Genesis. Fourth, we find in the stele Dr. Ben's famous quote, which has become controversial. We come from the mountains of the moon where God happy dwelt. Controversial because Dr. Ben sourced it to the Hunefer papyrus. But it is my belief that this quote is sourced not to the Hunefer papyrus, but can be found in the stele of Yebu. In short, the famine stele is a treasure for African people throughout the world and should sit at the first step in a foothill of all of our teachings in the academia, our educational institutions, our religious institutions, and in our homes, as the basis for our restoration and reconstruction of Mat. Among the treasures of the famine stela, or the stela of Yebu, there is an important line which, if read fast, we missed more than 20,000 years of Nile Valley civilization, which includes the time to our present time of Africa, the 5,000 years of Egyptian or Kemetic civilization, and the time of the earliest civilizations marching their way to Kemet from up south. What I'm going to present to you is the primary text that ends the discussion about the beginnings of the Nile Valley African, finally. Here's the glyphs, transliterations, and translations. The translation is Miriam Litcham's from one version of ancient literature. King Neterket is speaking, and you can see it in the glyph if you follow it, if you can read partial meta-netra or the transliterations, and you can check it. It correlates to almost all of the translations of this particular piece. King Neterket says, "He departed, he returned to me quickly. He let me know the flow of happy, his shores and all the things that they contain. He disclosed to me the hidden wonders to which the ancestors had made their way, and no king has equaled them since." Let me read the passage again. He departed. He returned to me quickly. He let me know the flow of happy, his shores and all the things they contain. He disclosed to me the hidden wonders to which the ancestors had made their way, and no king had equaled them since. This one line in Meta Nature is one of the most important historical statements of all of Africa. This line, rewritten from the 3rd dynasty by the Ptolemies, is a part of a conversation between the famous and deified architect Imhotep and his king Neterket Zoser. This statement is primary proof that the Nile Valley Africans knew that their ancestors came from up south, where the Nile began, and the Nile is sometimes called by the name of the Neter, happy. This one line has no equal in all of the ancient literature speaking about the source of the Nile. It is incredible because the world knows of Imhotep, who was a pyramid architect and builder. And he was scientific and also a priest, but a genius, and is an authoritative source. And it is he who is talking or telling the Norsut or King Neterket about the source of the Nile. Here's a section that precedes this where the conversation began concerning the famine and the Nile not inundated, which I will cover later in the formal presentation. I directed my heart to turn to the past. I consulted one of the staff of the Ibis, the chief elector priest Imhotep, son of Ptah, south of his wall, and I asked, in which place was Happy born? Which is the town of the sinuous one? Which god dwells there, that he might join with me? And if you can look at the glyphs, you could see the hieroglyphs for Miss Happy, begetting from happy, begetting, or where does the Nile come from? And you see the famous name of Imhotep. You can, and that you could see also, you can also see the Ibis for the staff of the Ibis. Further, it says, here are the glyphs for this passage. He stood, I shall go to the mansion of the net. It is designed to support a man and his deeds. I shall enter the house of life. Unrolls the souls of Re. I shall be guided by this. We look at the glyphs, and of course we can see the shrine of Tahuti, and you see the cow's head above it. You can see that is the sacred shrine of Tahuti, found most likely Hermopolis. You can see the temple, and then you can see the Ankh. So you see the temple, and then you see like the parent Ankh, or Ankh surrounded by 2 temples. And then you can see the Ba-Re. So you can see the bird, which is the soul, and then you can say Re after that. And then it says, I shall be guided by them. This is beautiful and important. We see a chief priest, Imhotep, being summoned by his king to find an answer from the past about the 7-year famine, and then see the priest go into the sacred temple, the shrine of Tahuti, called the Mansion of the Net. The sacred shrine is most likely in Kimenu or Hermopolis, and then go into the mystery system or the educational system, the Hawat Ankh, and consult the souls of Re, the text, the scrolls, the books, the library, and gets his answer about earlier Kemet, and says that he will be guided by them. What should be immediately important is that the souls of Re was information affecting Ta-Neter, the divine land, from an earlier period. This is what Neterket or Zoser sent Imhotep to get and consult. Again, these sections are the direct words of our ancestors in the Stele of Yabu, and our European historical counterparts have no other literature that can challenge this biographical conversation between the king Nefertari, also known as Zoser, and his chief priest, Imhotep. As I've said last year in other places, the human born in Africa is not a race of humanity, but the species of humanity itself. The human born in Africa is a prototype of humanity, and those groups of humans deriving themselves during and after the Worm-Reese Ice Age, or the races of humanity. The people born in Africa have primacy. They were the first to be created, the first to speak, the first to create language, and the first to read and write. They are the mothers and fathers of us all. In closing, the full presentation will discuss several things. First, it points to the ancestral memory written in the souls of Re of where the Nile Valley Africans sourced where they came from, which I have showed you. Second, it gives a first-person account of the king Nefertari and Imhotep discussing our educational system or mystery system, the Hawa, Ankh, or Per-Ankh. Third, it is most likely the oldest written account of God and man interacting, and is most likely the original source of several biblical stories, including the Adam and Eve, the Abraham, the Joseph story, and the Moses story. Fourth, we will hopefully get to examine Dr. Ben's famous and controversial quote, "We come from the mountains of the moon where God hath dwelt," and show that it is sourced to this document and not the Hunefer Papyrus, ending the controversial or the controversy of his statement, and showing that in fact that he was right and that the Africans did say that. The famine stele is a treasure for African people throughout the world and should sit as a first step on a foothill of all of our teachings in the academia, our educational institutions, our religious institutions, and in our homes, because it solves the question, where did the Nile Valley Africans say they came from? Further, it is the basis of our restoration and reconstruction of Ma'at. Oh, I almost forgot. At the conference, I will show you an ancient African civilization at least 12,000 years older than ancient Kemet, which answers the question, where did the Nile Valley Africans actually come from? Hotep.